For most of human history, China, and India for that matter, took the lion's share of global GDP, population, power, and prestige. Britain was a minnow. China was massive. Britain was a small regional power on the other side of the globe. China was the wealthiest and most prestigious society in the world. But in 1824, they fought deadly wars over something as seemingly benign and as simple as tea. In this video, we're going to learn how it completely flip-flopped the power balance between East and West. They subjugated and colonized entire continents for it, created vast smuggling networks to avoid people taxing it, built the world's fastest ships to carry it as quickly as possible all the way around the world. They created the world's first narco-style drug cartel, all with the purpose of earning enough laundered money to pay for tea. In the year 1800, the British were importing 24 million pounds of tea annually from China, enough to fill 1.5 Embraer jet planes per day. But this was becoming an unsustainable problem. To get the tea, they had to pay for it in silver. China would not accept anything else. Normally, a country could just sell other products to earn some money to pay for the trade, but China was strict. They made it clear to the British that they would only take silver and nothing else. The Qianlong Emperor himself bluntly told them in a letter, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce." I mean, witness how wealthy and powerful China was at this time. They truly did view Europeans as barbarians. They didn't want to consume their products because there was no reason to. So, the British had to pay for tea in silver, and they couldn't earn any silver back by selling goods to China, thus causing a trade deficit. Money was flowing to China, British royal coffers were emptying of currency, and the only thing they got in return was tea, a consumable. This is a bad situation, a very, very bad situation for the British. It doesn't take a genius economist to see how this is not sustainable. The British economy was literally being bled dry by this trade. Something had to be done. The solution came from the East India Company, the British corporation whose job it was to buy the tea from China and ship it back to Britain. Their big kooky idea was to literally create a drug cartel to addict the Chinese people to opium, all with the goal of earning illicit, laundered Chinese silver, to which they could then turn around and simply use that same silver to buy tea legally from regulated ports. You have to understand how powerful these corporations were back in this era. Imagine a corporation so powerful that it had one of the world's largest armies and navies, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of ships, all employed for company profits.
Private companies run by speculators and the odd crook took over huge chunks of foreign territory. They ran them as they liked, raising armies, doing deals with local rulers. The East India Company was the grandest of them.
People talk about unethical companies nowadays. But imagine if Microsoft could hire one of the world's largest armies to go out and beat up those they don't like. Like, oh, you got a competitor, you have Google? How about the Microsoft Navy blockades Google's main facility and forces users to no longer use Google search, but to instead use Bing? The East India Company conjures up an idea for this narcotics cartel based on its holdings in India. In the previous decades, like the 1750s to the 1790s, much of India has come under indirect or even direct control of the company. Like, they administered huge swaths of India as their own company territory. Specifically, they owned pretty much the entire Bengal region, a very productive region of what is modern-day Bangladesh and eastern India. The Bengal region was renowned for its high-quality fabrics and textiles. Actually, it's funny because that's the same industry that's the backbone of the Bangladeshi economy today.
Nothing that Britain produced then could match the rich patterns and colours of this Bengali textile. At one time, chintz made up 3/4 of India's exports.
This industry is rather inconvenient for the British, as they too were increasingly good at making textiles from places like the mills of Manchester. We're talking like the early parts of the Industrial Revolution, using water wheels to turn textile mills and automated looms. Britain is now competing with their own company's colony. The East India Company's idea was that they would replace Bengal's textile industry with their own products, exported from Britain. In turn, the British would encourage farmers in Bengal to grow opium, that is the source plant behind heroin. It is highly chemically addictive, deadly in large quantities, and currently illegal in basically every country across the globe.
Many newcomers who've arrived looking for work as the region develops have discovered the poppy too. People like innkeeper B. Sharma.
सोचता है मर वैसे तो सब खाने वाला है ऐसे ही है कोई मर भी जाता है कोई ये होता है किसी को घर में राशन भी खाने नहीं मिलता है कहानी खाने से हम ज़्यादा नहीं खाता हम एक टाइम सुबह खाता है एक टाइम शाम को खाता है वो तब क्या करे हो जाता है.
The opium trade has a profound impact on the Chinese economy, on the Chinese government, on Chinese society, and Chinese individuals. It's a winner for foreign traders. It has a devastating impact on Qing China.
You would find middle-class scholars whiling away their time by smoking opium pipes, perhaps in a dedicated opium parlor, or indeed men working in back-breaking labor who would take opium to try and ease the pain in their muscles.
I started to use it. I started to sniff it just to be part of the group. I started to use it while I was in school, and one day I woke up and I was addicted. I woke up and I was very sick, and I didn't know what was bringing it about. But I did find out that as soon as I took some heroin through my nose, I got well. I felt normal.
And once a fellow is on heroin, it may be years before he realizes or wants to admit to himself that he is indeed a junkie and that he is in need of help.
A fellow can start on narcotics, I would say, at any age, really, of course, and within a matter of 3 to 6 months, starting out at about $4 or $6 a day, he can work his way up to a $100 a day habit.
I was using about over $100 a day. Everything I would get was to go through my arms.
The company would take this grown opium, fill their ships with it, rock up to the shores of southern China laden with it, and then would illicitly peddle the stuff to willing Chinese merchants, who would in turn pay for it in silver, and then rock up back to China to sell it illegally as drug dealers.
But in the 1820s and 1830s, it accelerated dramatically. So dramatically that there was an imbalance in trade that was now in favor of Britain. Silver was leaving China in exchange for this opium.
Opium, it's like train spotting numbing to the brain. And even though it was illegal in China, the demand was obviously still there. Richer bureaucrats and nobles in China were getting increasingly addicted, and the push factor was present. That is, the British were industrially growing it and pushing it forcefully into China. So now, instead of British currency dwindling via tea purchases, they were now taking Chinese currency out through this trade, and then just recycling the silver that they took back into China, but this time legally, laundered. Currency is recycling, tea is leaving, and opium is coming in. This very bad situation for Britain has turned into a wonderful situation. And for China, a bad situation has turned far worse than ever thought possible. Even better for the British, their proto-industrializing economy is now earning the cash that it needs to incentivize it to grow, because the East India Company is selling their goods in Bengal. Win-win-win for the British and the company. Opium imports to China skyrocket by over 2,000% in this period. The Daoguang Emperor is witnessing his once mighty, wealthy country becoming sick, addicted, and poverty-stricken. But the Chinese authorities aren't stupid. They know there's a problem, and they're now motivated to stop it. they appointed this guy, Lin Zexu, as the emperor's man who would travel to southern China's Guangdong province and put an end to the opium trade once and for all. Lin was known as a hardliner, someone who would be extremely tough on the situation, but little did he know that he was about to make the situation far worse. Actually, Lin started out quite reasonably. He wrote a strongly worded letter directly to Queen Victoria, appealing to her morality and respect for laws. Since then you do not permit it to injure your own country, you ought not to have the injurious drug transferred to another country. Basically, treat others as you want to be treated. If the British public isn't hopped up on opium, why are you then forcing it on the Chinese people? Actually, this came from a slight misunderstanding on Lin's part. He thought that opium was banned in Britain. In reality, it was used for some medicinal practices and things like that, but it wasn't imported en masse, and it certainly wasn't recreationally smoked by millions or thousands of people. Pause and reflect for a moment. If you foreigners did not bring the opium hither, where should our Chinese people get it to resell? It is you foreigners who involve our simple natives in the pit of death, and are they alone to be permitted to escape alive? That one's pretty clear. British ships off the coast of China are pushing opium into the country and incentivizing Chinese people to buy it. Stop. We cannot bear to slay or exterminate without previous warning, and it is for this reason that we now clearly make known to you the fixed laws of our land. He's basically giving a warning. Obey the laws of China or we will kill you and your traffickers. The letter would never reach Queen Victoria. Receiving no response, Lin acted swiftly. He arrested thousands of opium dealers, confiscated opium pipes, and collected millions of pounds of opium, which he promptly destroyed on the beaches of Human. It's kind of fantastical how naive Lin and the Chinese authorities were at this time. Like, they thought they could just enforce the will of the emperor, and that would be that. And in the previous hundreds of years, they would be right. China won multiple wars against marauding European countries trying to influence them, and things went well. They truly believed that Little Britain had absolutely no recourse against massive China, and they were misguided. Especially in the belief that the British government would not act to protect the interests of their private traders with the full force and power of their state. The British Parliament thus made war preparations, and Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, drafted a letter back to the Chinese. These measures of hostility on the part of Great Britain against China are not only justified, but even rendered absolutely necessary by the outrages which have been committed by the Chinese authorities against British officers and subjects. And these hostilities will not cease until a satisfactory arrangement shall have been made by the Chinese government. Not only are you wrong to ban our drugs, but we're justified in using our military to force you to take them, whether you like it or not. Oh my God. Oh, and by the way, they also say China should pay for it. Quote, "The British government expects and demands that the expenses incurred thereby shall be repaid to Great Britain by the government of China. Take our opium and pay us for the destroyed opium. Don't like it? Tough. I've got gunboats." One might call it gunboat diplomacy. It seems like a lot of pain and suffering to go through just for tea, for a hot leaf juice. Why would they go through all this trouble to create an international drug cartel that would put Pablo Escobar to shame just for tea? And porcelain and silk and a few other things, but mostly for tea. Tea is not just a drink to the Chinese. There's a founding myth in Chinese folk religion. 5,000 years ago, in the ancient highlands, the Flame Emperor, Shunong, discovered the magic and the wonder of tea. Shunong was said to be a quasi-deity who possessed a crystal belly, where he could see physically inside at what he consumed to know which herbs that he ate were poisonous and which were good to eat. He's often depicted as this little hobgoblin character, just gnawing on various roots and other bits of detritus that he found on the forest floor. Nevertheless, this guy is very important to Chinese folk religion. He is the founding discoverer of not only tea, but also medicine and farming, which honestly I would say China rates at about the same level of importance. Seriously.
一碗茶汤，几千年的韵味， 中国人所念所想，依然是茶的本源，自然。
In reality, tea develops in this part of southwest China here, slowly spreads across China, and eventually starts spreading to surrounding Asian countries like Japan and Vietnam during about the 8th century. Buddhist monks loved tea, and so they brought it with them from China to Japan. This was an era where trade was flourishing in East Asia, spurred in large part by tea. You have to imagine a much lower stimulation world. Today in the 21st century, we're rocked by coffee, matcha, alcohol, cigarettes, nicotine, various types of legal and illegal drugs, prescription drugs, medicines, colorful advertisements, television, 90s internet websites, 4D IMAX experiences, TikTok, stimulation of all kinds and more. To an 8th century peasant, tea was pretty rock and roll. All of this expanding Asian tea culture gave rise to a tea mega superstar, Mr. Lu Yu. Lu Yu became the founding tea sage and the father of official Chinese tea culture. Encouraged from a young age to become a monk and live a life of relative asceticism, Lu Yu was instead obsessed by tea. He eventually moved to a secluded mountain in Huzhou, where he discussed tea with other masters, with one of them commenting about him, "Lu Yu is addicted to tea and originated the method of making tea." This addiction led him to write the seminal work in Chinese tea culture, the Classic of Tea. How to grow it, how to brew it, what to brew it with, how to consume it, and essentially it became the all-in-one, one-stop book for all Chinese tea culture.
每一个茶人，其实都在修行属于自己的茶道。
I mean, imagine if France had a classic of wine or Italy had a classic of pasta that were treated practically as gospel. That is what Lu Yu did for China. Lu Yu's admirers actually did worship him and his work as a kind of tea gospel. He met the Emperor of China, and quote, "None were too rich or too poor to pay him reverence." Apparently, 35 milligrams of caffeine in a cup of green tea, along with the fame, ended up going to Lu Yu's head. He ended up burnt out and living a life alone as a hermit. But the impact he made was undeniable. I'm telling you these things because I want to emphasize the important spiritual origin to tea in China. How important it is for Chinese society then and now, and how respected it is. A Chinese tea ceremony is quite a spiritual experience. It's like something in between gastronomy and religion. Seriously. Zooming now forward hundreds of years to the 1500s. Europeans first start arriving on the shores of Asia after the Portuguese discovered a maritime route around Africa.
And the British and other traders, the Portuguese, the Dutch, were all thinking, what is it that the Chinese would buy so that we can get that silver out and then we can buy more tea?
This is going to change everything. Time for capitalism and global trade. Driving forces behind incredible increases in living standards, and also, at times, incredible increases in violence. Quote, "The Japanese are very fond of an herb agreeable to the taste, which they call cha," wrote Father Almeida, a Portuguese missionary in Japan in 1565. Actually, funny enough, the Portuguese still call tea cha, which is the Chinese origin word for tea. In 1610, it gets serious though. Another missionary, this time from Italy, writes, "And there is not alone a single quality of excellence in this leaf, for one surpasses the other, and thus you will often buy some at 1 gold a skou, or even 2 or 3 escous a pound, if it is rated at the best. The most excellent is sold at 10 and more, often at 12 gold escous a pound in Japan. Oh, cha-ching, baby, we're talking money now." The majority of European expeditions into Asia during this period are private companies, like the East India Company. They were often supported by the state and blur the lines between country and company, but nonetheless their goal is to trade and generate profits.
For more than 3 centuries, it was trade, not conquest, which brought new colonies into the empire, though it was often trade at the end of a gun or a sword.
Opium was making Britain rich. It soon accounted for over 1/5 of the income of the government of India. 2 mighty empires, each convinced of their own superiority, were now set on collision course.
When Europeans start to realize how valuable the best qualities of tea can be, they start to bring it back home. As we discussed a bit before, stimulants were hard to come by, and tea was very valuable in Asia. Many Europeans, at least in the wealthy, had coffee, but it was expensive and it expired easily. This combination of money, the ability to store it long term, and the stimulation set the Europeans off. Doctors across Europe, especially in Germany, are loving it. It's being used for medicine, socialization, stimulation. The Europeans are becoming increasingly hooked. Believe it or not though, the English, some of the world's biggest modern tea lovers and the perpetrators of the not-so-savory parts of the first act, are barely drinking it at all at this point. Actually, they're more of a coffee people, something they'd been importing and consuming from the Ottoman Empire for a few hundred years at that point. They certainly were interested though. Here's what the had to say about it in 1659. I must desire you to procure the cha, if possible. I care not what it cost. 'Tis for a good uncle of mine, Dr. Sheldon, whom some body hath persuaded to study the divinity of that herb, leaf, or what else it is. And I am so obliged to satisfy his curiosity that I could willingly undertake a voyage to Japan or China to do it.
You and me both.
Tea was probably first sold at Garraway's Coffee House in 1657. These were swarthy places where men would get together and do business and gamble and drink coffee and sometimes alcohol as well. And women were forbidden from entering. And look at this petition by women against coffee and coffee houses from 1674. According to the petition, coffee made men, quote, as unfruitful as the sandy deserts from where that unhappy berry is said to be brought. Meaning that they were claiming it made men infertile and contributed to the declining birth rate of the era. All of this would be changed, however, when King Charles II of England married the Portuguese princess, Catherine of Braganza. At the English court, she witnessed the English ladies and gentlemen having, quote, habitually heated or stupefied their brains morning, noon, and night. Apparently, the high lords and ladies of the English court in the 17th century were absolutely blasted at all times pre-tea. The English court was drunk. The upper and merchant classes were caffeinating themselves with coffee. Katerina wanted a change. She started importing tea and drinking it at court, instantaneously propelling the drink to become extremely fashionable. King Charles II also preferred the mild effects that tea had on his subjects, and therefore began to shut down English coffee houses, citing them as places of delinquency, forcing many to transform themselves into the much more benign tea houses. Not selling coffee, but only tea. No longer was it only swarthy men in coffee houses. They became open to women too. Grocers began selling tea. There were tea controversies. But even though the tea had only mild physical effects on the English population, it caused the East India Company to conduct its business in Asia in a manner that could only be described as anything but mild. English demand for tea during the 1700s is skyrocketing, with every year breaking new records. The English crown recognizes that they can slap a tea tax on every pound of tea, earning huge amounts of revenue for the coffers off of this massive and lucrative trade.
There would be a monopoly, and only British tea could be drunk. Well, people understood that that would eventually mean higher prices, that it would mean less competition. There were lots of little petty merchants who depended on selling tea to make their livelihood at the time.
The taxes were so high, though, that it heavily incentivized pirates and smugglers to literally illegally smuggle it into Britain to avoid paying the taxes. According to Lipton Tea's website, more tea was smuggled into Britain in the 18th century than was legally imported. Tea also became popular in the American colonies as well, eventually leading to the American colonists throwing the tea into Boston Harbor in protest of having to pay taxes that they had no representation for. This leads to a whole Revolutionary War and blah blah blah. You probably know all about that. America wins, Britain loses that war. But what every American school kid is taught is that the lack of representation, the lack of ability to legislate upon the British tea tax that they were nonetheless forced to pay as subjects, was a massive motivator in pushing the Americans to violently rebel. Not alcohol, not coffee, nor opium, tea. The British East India Company dominated the world with their powerful tea monopoly in Europe. But it wasn't yet enough. As we recall, the company and the British state were losing silver bullion to the Chinese to purchase tea. Britain could not accept this situation. It had to do something. And it had this double motivator of the company losing silver unsustainably to China and the British government needing the flow of tea to continue so that it could continue to tax it and earn revenue. It definitely didn't want to lose a source of taxes a second time. Thus, the opium trade triangle was created. British exports of opium to China skyrocketed. We know how this goes. China puts a stop to it, the British say, "Oh no, you won't."
This is the China I offer you.
And so began the First Opium War. Britain was wildly successful in this war. The superior ships and guns that they possessed were ideal for defeating the poorly equipped Chinese junks. After the British won the war and sat down at the treaty table with the Chinese, they forced them not only to continue taking the opium, but also to cede the island of Hong Kong, as well as open up a bunch of other treaty ports across the Chinese coast. The treaty signed after this war was the first of the so-called unequal treaties that ended up humiliating China for the next 80 years and are now branded into the psyche of modern Chinese governments as well as the people back then. These were treaties that forced what used to be the world's wealthiest and most powerful society to cede sovereignty, allow the narcotics trade to continue along with the sickness and the backwardsness that this caused. It began an entire century of humiliation, as it is now referred to. It still impacts drug policy in modern China. I mean, they're still extremely aggressive against drug imports as a direct result of the Opium Wars. But unfortunately for China, it actually gets worse. What's better than continuing to send money to China for tea? Perhaps undercutting the market and growing it yourself. Or rather, using your subjugated colony to grow it for you. But tea at the time needed very specific climactic conditions, more or less only found in the interior of China. And even though China was forced to sign the unequal treaties and do a bunch of stuff it didn't want to do on its coasts, the interior was something different, and the British couldn't really influence that. The Chinese refused to allow any living plants to leave the country. Scottish botanist Robert Fortune was hired to venture into the interior of China, learn the local ways of the tea growers, and illegally smuggle tea plants out of the country. Fortune ended up successful in his mission, and one of his smuggled tea plants ended up being the basis for the Indian tea variant, now almost indistinguishable from the Chinese one. They could grow it in a climactically similar region called Assam and use Indian forced labor to do so. In 1867, Britain imported over 100 million pounds of Chinese tea and just over 6 million pounds of Indian. By 1907, the numbers had completely flip-flopped. Britain imported less than 10 million pounds of Chinese tea and over 160 million of Indian. The story of tea is one of colonial domination, gunboat diplomacy, and power reversal. The Western European powers became the dominant players in the global economy, and the once mighty China would have to suffer for decades while it languished behind technologically, economically, and militarily. After all of this, luckily tea is more peaceful nowadays. Fun fact, tea is grown in Europe, it's just grown way out in the middle of the Atlantic in the Portuguese Azores Islands. If you enjoyed that video, we would greatly appreciate if you subscribed. Hopefully see you in the next one.